As night settles in and the world grows quiet, you are invited to rest your thoughts and slow your breathing. Tonight's story drifts gently through a forgotten chapter of American history, one rarely spoken of, yet deeply woven into the nation's past. There is nothing here that demands urgency, only a calm unfolding meant to ease you toward deep, natural sleep. Allow your eyes to close as your mind follows a quiet journey through time, where history is told softly, without conflict or alarm, only reflection, understanding, and stillness. This is a story for rest, for learning without effort, and for letting go of the day. If this peaceful space helps you relax, consider subscribing to support more calming history stories designed for better sleep. You're also welcome to share in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Where it's a quiet town, a busy city, or somewhere in between, knowing your location helps us create stories that feel closer to home. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath in, and as you breathe out, let history fade gently into sleep. When the cannons finally fell silent, the quiet that followed was unlike any peace America had ever known. It was not the gentle quiet of a settled evening, nor the comforting stillness that comes before sleep. Instead, it was a wide, unfamiliar silence, one that stretched across fields, towns, and cities, carrying with it the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that remained uncertain. Across the country, people stepped cautiously into this new quiet. Soldiers returned home along dusty roads, their footsteps slower than when they had marched away. Farms resumed their rhythms, though many hands were missing. Church bells rang again, not to warn or rally, but to mark ordinary hours. And yet, beneath these signs of normal life, the nation felt suspended awake, but not at ease. In the South, landscapes bore the marks of years of struggle. Rail lines lay twisted, fences broken, and fields left untended. In the North, factories continued to hum, but conversations had changed. The war was over, yet its presence lingered in memories, in glances, in the careful way people chose their words. No document could erase what had been seen, and no declaration could instantly mend what had been torn apart. For many Americans, this quiet brought relief. Parents listened for footsteps at the door, hoping a son or husband might still return. Others grieved in silence, knowing no footsteps would ever come again. Even joy, when it appeared, was subdued, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had replaced the noise of war. The nation had survived, but it was unclear what kind of nation it had become. In Washington, leaders spoke of rebuilding and reconciliation. There were hopes spoken softly, sometimes only in private, that the country could be made whole again. Abraham Lincoln had once urged Americans to move forward with malice toward none, imagining a future guided by compassion rather than punishment. His words remained, even as his presence was gone, echoing gently in a capital unsure of its next steps. Far from the halls of government, ordinary people faced their own questions. What did freedom mean now? What did loyalty look like after neighbors had stood on opposite sides? In small towns, former soldiers met again in stores and on porches, their shared past both a bond and a barrier. Conversations often drifted to the weather, the harvest, or familiar routines, safer ground than the memories no one quite knew how to discuss. For newly freed Black Americans, the quiet carried a different meaning. Silence was no longer enforced in the same way it had been before, yet uncertainty remained. Freedom had arrived, but its shape was still undefined. Communities gathered quietly, sometimes in churches, sometimes in open fields, to talk, to listen, and to imagine what life might become. These were moments of cautious hope, unfolding without fanfare. Marked by patience rather than celebration, children born during the war now grew in a world that did not fully explain itself. They sensed the tension in adult voices, the pauses that lingered too long, the way certain topics were gently avoided. History was present everywhere, yet rarely spoken of directly. It lived in the stillness between sentences. In the careful way, the past was remembered or not remembered at all. As days passed, the quiet settled into routine. Markets reopened. Schools slowly resumed. Letters traveled between states again, carrying news that was no longer measured in victories or defeats, but in ordinary concerns. Life, persistent and steady, continued its forward motion. Yet this was not a simple peace. It was a pause, a moment between what had been and what had not yet been decided. Beneath the calm surface, questions waited patiently. How would justice be defined? Who would be protected? What promises would be kept, and which would quietly fade away? At night, as lamps were lit and conversations ended, many Americans lay awake with these thoughts. The country had avoided collapse, but its future remained unfinished. In that stillness, the nation breathed slowly, uncertainly, carrying both exhaustion and expectation. This quiet after the cannons was not an ending. It was a beginning that did not yet know its own name. And so, as the land rested beneath starlight and the sounds of war remained only in memory, America entered a new chapter, one written not with noise, but with choices made quietly, over time. Choices that would shape generations long after the silence itself had faded. For now, though there was only the calm of night, the soft passage of hours, and a nation learning slowly how to live with itself, again peace arrived quietly, without ceremony, and many Americans were unsure how to welcome it. After years of listening for distant thunder that was not weather, the sudden calm felt unfamiliar. The land itself seemed to pause, as though waiting for instruction. Peace, it turned out, was not a single moment, but a slow and uncertain process. In towns across the country, people resumed ordinary habits with careful attention. Shops reopened their doors. Roads grew busier again. Mail routes were restored, carrying letters that spoke not of battles, but of family matters and small hopes. These simple acts gave the appearance of normal life returning, yet beneath them lay questions no one could easily answer. What did peace truly mean after such division? For some, peace meant survival. It meant waking each morning without fear of sudden disruption. It meant meals shared without interruption and nights passed without alarms. This version of peace was quiet and deeply personal, shaped by exhaustion rather than celebration. For others, peace felt incomplete. The war had settled political questions on paper, but human relationships were far more complicated. Neighbors who once shared fences now shared only polite distance. Trust, once broken, was slow to rebuild. Words were chosen carefully, and silences often spoke more than conversations. In the countryside, farmers returned to land that had changed as much as they had. Fields required attention, but labor was scarce. Seasons continued as they always had, indifferent to human conflict. Planting still followed spring. Harvest still arrived in autumn. Nature, steady and patient, offered a quiet lesson in endurance. In cities, particularly in places like Washington, D.C., peace took on a political shape. Meetings were held, plans drafted, and speeches delivered with hopeful language. Leaders spoke of unity and rebuilding, yet even they understood that peace could not be commanded. It had to be lived, day by day, by millions of individuals carrying different memories of the same war. Families, too, learned that peace had layers. A household might be reunited, yet forever changed. A chair at the table might remain empty. A familiar voice might be missed in the evening quiet. Grief did not disappear when the fighting ended. It simply became quieter, settling into daily life like a shadow at the edge of the room. For newly freed Black Americans, peace was intertwined with uncertainty. The war had ended slavery, but it had not yet defined freedom. Peace offered possibility, but not assurance. Communities gathered calmly to discuss education, work, and family life, knowing that peace without protection could be fragile. Still, there was determination in these gatherings, a steady belief that something better could be built. Even if slowly, children growing up in this time sensed the change without fully understanding it. They played in streets once filled with soldiers and learned lessons in schools reopening after years of disruption. Their world was quieter, but adults around them carried emotions that could not be easily explained. Peace, for these children, became the background of memory rather than a clearly defined event. Churches and meeting halls became spaces of reflection. Sermons focused on healing, forgiveness, and patience. Music returned, softly at first, filling rooms that had once echoed with urgent calls and somber prayers. These moments offered comfort not by erasing the past, but by acknowledging it gently. Yet peace was not evenly distributed. In some regions, tension lingered more strongly. Old power structures resisted change, and uncertainty shaped daily interactions. Still, even here, life continued in small, steady ways. Meals were cooked. Children were taught. The ordinary rhythms of existence persisted, reminding people that peace often arrives not with triumph, but with persistence. As months passed, the meaning of peace slowly evolved. It became less about the absence of war and more about the presence of routine. It lived in predictable mornings and familiar evenings. It was found in the comfort of knowing tomorrow would resemble today. At night, when lamps dimmed and conversations ended, Americans lay listening to the sounds of a country relearning itself. Crickets replaced cannon fire. Wind moved through trees instead of smoke. The land, though marked by history, rested beneath the same stars it always had. Peace, in this broken land, was not perfect. It was uneven, uncertain, and often incomplete. But it existed in quiet moments, in patient efforts, and in the collective decision to continue forward. And so, without announcements or celebrations, peace settled in not as an answer, but as a beginning. A fragile, evolving state of being that would shape the long journey ahead. As the night deepened, and the world grew still once more, the nation rested within this fragile calm, learning slowly what peace might become. In the quiet months after the war, one voice continued to echo across the country, even though it was no longer alive to speak. Abraham Lincoln had imagined an end to conflict that would feel more like healing than victory. His words, spoken near the close of his life, carried a calm that contrasted with the violence that had come before. He asked the nation to move forward with malice toward none, and in doing so, offered a vision that was less about power and more about patience. This vision did not arrive as a command. It was an invitation. Lincoln understood that the war had altered the country in ways no law could quickly undo. He spoke not of punishment, but of binding wounds, not of triumph, but of care. In the stillness that followed his death, Americans returned to these words, reading them slowly, as if searching for guidance on how to live in a nation that had survived itself. In Washington, his absence was deeply felt. The city continued its routines, yet something steady had vanished. Meetings carried on, papers were signed, and decisions were made. But the quiet reassurance Lincoln once offered was missing. His vision lingered, but it lacked a guiding hand. For many Americans, especially those exhausted by years of struggle, Lincoln's words provided comfort. They suggested that reconciliation was possible, that the future did not have to be shaped by anger. In homes across the country, people spoke of him not as a distant leader, but as a presence that had felt familiar, almost personal. Yet a vision, no matter how gentle, requires careful tending that, as the nation attempted to follow Lincoln's path, it quickly discovered how difficult his request truly was. Forgiveness did not come easily to those who had lost family members. Trust did not return quickly between communities divided by loyalty and memory. Even goodwill, when it existed, was fragile. Still, there were moments quiet and often unnoticed when Lincoln's vision seemed to take hold. In towns where former enemies exchanged simple greetings. In churches where prayers focused on unity rather than blame. In schools where children were taught lessons meant to look forward rather than back. These moments did not make headlines. They did not announce themselves. They existed softly, in ordinary interactions that suggested another kind of future might be possible. Lincoln's hope for a compassionate Reconstruction rested on the belief that time, guided by empathy, could reshape the nation. He believed that healing required restraint, understanding, and humility. It was a vision rooted not in speed, but in steadiness. For newly freed Black Americans, Lincoln's words carried particular meaning. Though freedom had been declared, its protection remained uncertain. Still, the idea of a nation committed to justice and care offered a foundation, something to believe in during uncertain days. Lincoln's vision suggested that freedom was not only legal, but moral. deserving of respect and protection, as days turned into months, and months into years. The distance between Lincoln's vision and reality grew more noticeable. Political pressures mounted, patience wore thin, compromises were made that favored stability over fairness. The nation, tired and eager to move on, often chose convenience over compassion. Yet Lincoln's words did not disappear. They remained in textbooks, in speeches, and in quiet reflections. They surfaced during moments of doubt, reminding Americans that another path had once been imagined, one less hurried, less harsh, and more humane. At night, when the world grew quiet and thoughts wandered freely, many reflected on what might have been possible had that vision been fully realized, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. What would the nation look like if patience had guided policy, if healing had been given more time? Lincoln's vision was never about perfection. It was about intention, about choosing care even when it was difficult, about recognizing shared humanity in the aftermath of division. As the country moved forward without him, his absence became part of the story itself, a reminder that leadership shapes not only decisions, but tone, that the way a nation speaks to itself matters just as much as the laws it passes. In the stillness of the night, as lamps dimmed and conversations ended, Lincoln's words continued to rest quietly in the American consciousness, not demanding action, not insisting on answers, simply waiting like a calm voice reminding the nation of what it once hoped to become. And so, as history continued its slow unfolding, Lincoln's gentle vision remained a soft echo from the past, offering guidance to those willing to listen, and comfort to those seeking rest in the long journey of becoming whole again. Reconstruction did not arrive with certainty or clear direction. It came quietly, almost hesitantly, like a conversation begun in a hushed voice. After years of overwhelming noise, the nation found itself speaking softly, unsure which words might heal and which might reopen wounds. Across the country, people sensed that something new was beginning, even if they could not yet name it. The war had decided who would remain united, but it had not explained how that unity should function. Reconstruction emerged as an idea shaped more by hope than by clarity, a promise still waiting to be defined. In the Capitol, discussions unfolded slowly within the halls of the United States Congress. Lawmakers debated how best to rebuild states that had been torn apart and how to reintegrate communities that had once stood in opposition. Their words were careful, measured, and often uncertain. There was agreement that rebuilding was necessary, but less agreement on what rebuilding truly meant. Outside Washington, Reconstruction was experienced not as policy, but as daily life. In towns across the South, people adjusted to new social arrangements. Freed families sought work, education, and stability. Landowners faced a changing labor system. Everyone, in one way or another, was learning to navigate a world that no longer followed familiar rules. Hope existed in small, quiet forms. Schools began to appear in places where learning had long been denied. Classrooms were simple, sometimes no more than a shared room and a chalkboard, but they represented possibility. Children and adults alike gathered to learn letters and numbers, not with urgency, but with focus and patience. Education became a soft light in a time of uncertainty. Churches also played a steady role in this period. They were places of gathering, reflection, and planning. Sermons spoke gently about responsibility, dignity, and community. These spaces offered structure when much else felt unsettled. Within them, Reconstruction felt less like a distant political process and more like a shared human effort. For many Americans, especially those newly freed, Reconstruction represented the first chance to shape their own futures openly. This did not come with celebration or ease, but with quiet determination. Families planned their days carefully. Communities organized slowly. Progress, when it came, arrived step by step. In the North, Reconstruction was viewed from a distance. Newspapers reported developments with a mix of optimism and fatigue. The country had given much already, and patience was wearing thin. Still, many believed that the effort was worthwhile, that the nation could be reshaped into something fairer, more balanced, and more just. Yet Reconstruction's hopeful whispers were fragile. The process required trust, and trust was in short supply. Old habits and assumptions lingered. Change moved unevenly, welcomed in some places and resisted in others. Even so, life continued forward, guided by the quiet belief that rebuilding, however slow, was better than returning to conflict. Children growing up during this time sensed that optimism without fully understanding it. They attended newly opened schools, heard new ideas spoken aloud, and grew into a society still deciding what it would allow itself to become. For them, Reconstruction was not a policy, but an environment, one filled with cautious possibility. As weeks turned into months, the nation found a rhythm within this uncertainty. Reconstruction did not erase the past, but it offered a framework for moving beyond it. Laws were discussed, communities organized, and individuals adapted. No single moment defined success or failure. Instead, the era unfolded gradually, shaped by countless small decisions. At night, when lamps were extinguished and the day's concerns were set aside, many Americans rested with guarded hope. The future was unclear, but it was open in a way it had not been before. Reconstruction, still young and uncertain, waited quietly to see what would become of its promise. The whispers of hope that marked its beginning were not loud enough to drown out doubt, but they were steady. They persisted in classrooms, churches, and homes, gentle reminders that rebuilding a nation was not about speed, but about direction. And so, in the calm hours after sunset, as the country settled into rest, Reconstruction continued its quiet work, not with force or urgency, but with patience, inviting a weary nation to imagine itself whole again. Freedom did not arrive all at once, nor did it announce itself with certainty. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like morning light entering a quiet room. For those who had lived under slavery, freedom was real but unfamiliar. It required learning, patience, and careful steps into a world that had not yet adjusted to their presence as equals. Across the South, newly freed individuals began shaping daily routines that were once controlled by others. Simple decisions: where to live, when to work, how to spend an afternoon now carried new meaning. These choices were not dramatic, but they were deeply personal. Freedom was discovered in moments that felt ordinary to some, yet profound to others. Families searched for one another, guided by memory and hope. Names were spoken softly in churches and town centers. Notices were shared. When reunions happened, they were often quiet, marked by long embraces rather than words. When reunions did not happen, grief was carried privately, folded into the work of moving forward. Work itself took on a different shape. Labor was no longer forced, but opportunity was limited. Many continued working the same land they had known before, now negotiating wages and terms. These negotiations were careful and uneven, shaped by both possibility and constraint. Still, the act of asking, of being heard, was itself a step into freedom. Education became one of the clearest expressions of this new life. Adults and children gathered wherever learning could take place. Lessons were taught slowly, with attention and respect. Reading and writing were approached not as skills alone, but as tools for independence. Each word learned felt like a door opening quietly. Organizations emerged to assist in this transition, including the Freedmen's Bureau, which helped provide support in education, labor agreements, and basic needs. Its presence was not perfect or permanent, but it represented an acknowledgement that freedom required structure and care to take root. Churches became anchors during this time. They offered more than worship. They offered community. Meetings were held to discuss shared goals, concerns, and hopes. These gatherings were calm and purposeful, centered on dignity rather than urgency. Faith, for many, became a steady companion in uncertain days. Children born into freedom grew differently from those who remembered slavery. Their world still held limitations, but it also held new expectations. They learned letters, listened to stories of the past, and absorbed the careful optimism of their elders. For them, freedom was not a sudden change, was the ground beneath their feet. Freedom, however, was not without tension. Its boundaries were unclear, and its protections uneven. Some welcomed the changes, while others resisted them quietly or openly. Still, most daily interactions unfolded without spectacle. Life moved forward through routines, meals prepared, fields tended, lessons taught. In the north, many observed these developments from afar. Freedom was often discussed in abstract terms, as an achievement already secured. On the ground, however, freedom was still being defined through habits, customs, and unspoken rules that shaped daily life. Despite uncertainty, there was resilience. Communities formed networks of mutual support. Skills were shared. Time was taken to build something lasting, even when resources were scarce. Freedom was not treated as an ending, but as a beginning that required care. At night, as households settled into rest, thoughts turned quietly toward tomorrow. What might be possible next week, next year, for the next generation? These questions were not asked loudly. They were carried gently, like hopes placed carefully aside until morning. Freedom, as it emerged during Reconstruction, was neither simple nor complete. It was cautious, evolving, and deeply human. It lived in choices made slowly, in trust built carefully, and in the determination to continue even when the path forward remained uncertain. As the stars rose and the land grew still, this new freedom rested alongside the nation itself, not fully formed, not fully protected, but present, waiting, growing, discovered not all at once, but moment by moment. In the quiet rhythm of everyday life, as Reconstruction continued, the work of rebuilding moved quietly from homes and communities into the written word. Laws began to take shape not hurriedly, but with the careful intention of permanence. These were not laws meant for a single moment, but for generations yet to come. Their purpose was simple in spirit, even if complex in practice: to guide the nation toward fairness. In the chambers of the United States Congress, lawmakers debated how freedom could be protected beyond spoken promises. Words spoken aloud could fade, but words written into law carried weight. The nation had learned, through hard experience, that ideals needed structure in order to endure. At the center of these efforts stood the United States Constitution, a document that had shaped the country from its beginning, yet now required expansion. The Constitution had survived the war, but it had also revealed its limits. Reconstruction sought not to replace it, but to strengthen it, to bring its principles closer to the reality Americans were now living. New amendments were introduced with careful language and deliberate pacing. Each sentence was examined closely. Each phrase carried responsibility. These additions aimed to clarify what freedom meant, who belonged within it, and how it should be protected. Rather than dramatic declarations, the amendments spoke in steady, formal tones, reflecting the seriousness of their purpose. For many Americans, these changes felt distant. Laws were discussed in newspapers and speeches, but daily life continued much as before. Still, beneath ordinary routines, something important was happening. The framework of the nation was being adjusted, quietly and methodically, to reflect lessons learned through great sacrifice. For newly freed Black Americans, these laws carried deep significance. Though written in formal language, they represented recognition and acknowledgement that freedom and citizenship were not privileges to be granted or withdrawn at will, but rights to be upheld. These ideas offered reassurance, even as their enforcement remained uncertain. Education played a role here as well. Teachers explained new concepts of citizenship and rights in simple terms. Discussions unfolded patiently, helping communities understand what these changes meant not just legally, but personally. Knowledge, like freedom, was shared gradually, allowing understanding to take root. In some places, these laws were welcomed with optimism. In others, they were met with hesitation or quiet resistance. Still, the process continued. Laws moved forward, not because they were universally accepted, but because the nation had committed itself, at least on paper, to a fairer standard. Reconstruction-era legislation was not loud or dramatic in daily life. It did not announce itself with bells or banners. Instead, it existed quietly in courthouses, schools, and civic records. Its presence was felt over time. shaping expectations and slowly influencing how people saw themselves and one another. Children growing up during this period absorbed these changes without fully realizing it. They learned that citizenship had meaning, that laws applied beyond custom, that words, written long before they were born, could shape their futures. For them, fairness was not an abstract ideal, it was something being discussed, taught, and gradually normalized. As years passed, these laws became part of the background of American life. They were referenced calmly, taught carefully, and debated thoughtfully. Even when they were ignored or challenged, their existence mattered. They remained as markers of intention, evidence that the nation had once tried to define justice more clearly. Night. When the work of the day was done and the world settled into rest, these laws continued their quiet work. They did not change hearts instantly. They did not erase conflict, but they waited steady and patient, ready to support progress whenever opportunity allowed. Reconstruction's legal efforts remind us that fairness is rarely achieved all at once. It is written slowly, revised carefully, and tested over time. Laws are not endings, but foundation structures upon which future generations build. As the lamps dimmed and the nation rested, these carefully chosen words remained awake within the Constitution, holding space for a tomorrow that, though uncertain, had been imagined with care. And so, in the calm rhythm of history unfolding, the laws of Reconstruction stood quietly, promises written not in haste, but in hope. While laws were written and hopes carefully shaped, daily life continued in quiet, practical ways. Most Americans experienced Reconstruction not through speeches or documents, but through ordinary routines. Peace, still unfinished, settled into mornings and evenings, shaping habits more than headlines. In towns and rural communities alike, people focused on what needed to be done next. Meals were prepared, children were guided through lessons. Work resumed, sometimes familiar, sometimes newly defined. These tasks did not erase uncertainty, but they provided structure, something steady to return to each day. In the countryside, fields were planted again. The rhythm of agriculture, unchanged by politics, offered comfort. Seeds went into the ground as they always had. Seasons moved forward without hesitation. For many, tending the land became a way to reconnect with stability. Even as social arrangements continued to shift. In towns, stores reopened with limited supplies. Conversations at counters were polite and brief. People spoke about prices, weather, and repair-safe topics that allowed interaction without reopening old divisions. Peace lived in these exchanges, fragile but present. In cities such as Richmond, life moved cautiously forward. Streets once crowded with soldiers now carried workers and families. Buildings bore reminders of the past, yet daily activity slowly reshaped their purpose. Markets, schools, and churches regained their roles as gathering places, offering routine and familiarity. For newly freed Black Americans, daily life involved both opportunity and vigilance. Work agreements were negotiated carefully. Communities leaned on shared support, helping one another navigate challenges quietly and patiently. Progress came in small steps, measured not by sudden change, but by consistency. Education continued to grow during this period. Schools, often modest and under-resourced, became centers of hope. Teachers worked with determination, guiding students through lessons that extended beyond reading and writing. They taught confidence, responsibility, and the belief that learning itself was a form of freedom. Churches remained anchors of community life. Services were calm, reflective, and purposeful. Beyond worship, these spaces hosted meetings, celebrations, and discussions about the future. They offered continuity in a time when much felt uncertain. Children adapted quickly to this environment. They accepted new routines without fully understanding their significance. Play returned to streets and fields. Laughter reappeared, not loudly, but naturally. For them, unfinished peace was simply the world they knew. In households across the country, evenings were often spent quietly. Lamps were lit, stories were shared, letters were written. Families rested in the presence of one another, finding comfort in familiarity. even when concerns lingered. Nighttime offered a pause from decision-making and debate, yet unfinished peace carried tension just beneath the surface. Social boundaries were being redrawn, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes unevenly. Not all changes were welcomed, and not all progress was protected. Still, most days passed without incident, shaped more by effort than by conflict. In the North, daily life felt steadier, though not untouched by change. News from the South arrived through newspapers and letters, shaping opinions slowly. Many followed events with interest, others with fatigue. Reconstruction, for them, unfolded at a distance, woven into conversations but rarely into daily routine. Time moved forward, in this unfinished piece, guided by repetition. Each day built upon the last. Small improvements accumulated quietly. Mistakes were made, adjustments followed, and life continued. At night, when the world grew still, the unfinished nature of peace became easier to accept. In darkness, the need for immediate answers softened. The future did not demand resolution all at once. It could wait until morning. This period of reconstruction was not defined by dramatic turning points in daily life, but by endurance. People learned to live within uncertainty, finding balance between memory and possibility. Peace, though incomplete, was enough to allow rest. As stars rose and households settled into sleep, the nation breathed quietly. Unfinished peace rested alongside its people, not perfect, not secure, but present enough to carry them into another day. And so, through routine and patience, daily life continued gently shaping the nation's next chapter, one ordinary moment at a time. Although daily life appeared calm, something unsettled lingered quietly beneath the routines of Reconstruction. It was not always spoken of, and rarely announced itself openly, but it could be felt in pauses, in guarded expressions, and in the careful way people chose their words. This was not the fear of open conflict, but a quieter uncertainty one that lived beneath the surface of an unfinished piece. In many communities, change arrived faster on paper than in practice. New laws existed, new possibilities had been named, yet habits formed over generations were slow to shift. People adjusted outwardly while holding inward doubts. Politeness often replaced honesty, and silence became a form of protection. For newly freed Black Americans, this underlying tension was especially present. Freedom had opened doors, but it had not removed all risks. Daily decisions where to work, when to travel, how openly to speak were made with care. Most days passed without incident, yet awareness remained. Caution became part of routine, woven gently into everyday life. In towns and rural areas, conversations sometimes stopped when unfamiliar footsteps approached. Meetings were held quietly, plans were shared selectively. This was not fear that dominated the day, but awareness that shaped behavior, like adjusting one's pace in unfamiliar terrain. For white communities adjusting to Reconstruction, uncertainty took different forms. Long-held assumptions were being challenged, often without clear guidance on what should replace them. Some responded with curiosity, others with hesitation. Many chose to wait and see, observing change from a distance rather than engaging directly. In public spaces, interactions remained mostly civil. Markets operated, churches opened their doors, and schools continued their lessons. Yet, beneath these visible signs of normalcy, trust was uneven. People measured their responses carefully, unsure how much the future would resemble the past. Children sensed these undercurrents without fully understanding them. They noticed when adults lowered their voices, when certain topics were avoided, when routes home changed without explanation. Still, they played, learned, and slept peacefully, absorbing the world as it was presented to them. At night, when households grew quiet, these unspoken concerns often surfaced. Thoughts wandered freely in the stillness. Questions lingered without answers. What would tomorrow bring? How lasting were the changes taking place? Would progress continue or quietly retreat? Fear beneath the surface did not always come from immediate threats. Often, it arose from uncertainty itself. Reconstruction was reshaping society, but its direction was not guaranteed. The absence of clarity created space for worry, even in moments of calm. Yet this fear did not define the era entirely. Alongside it existed resilience. People continued to build, teach, worship, and plan. Communities supported one another quietly. Confidence grew in small increments, shaped by experience rather than promises. Courage often appeared not as bold action, but as persistence. In the North, reports of unrest or resistance were read alongside stories of progress. Distance softened the sense of fear, turning it into abstraction. For many, Reconstruction felt increasingly complex, harder to follow, and easier to set aside. Time moved forward regardless. Days followed nights. Seasons changed. Fear, like hope, became part of the landscape present, but not overwhelming. It informed decisions without halting life entirely. In moments of stillness, Americans learned to live with uncertainty. They rested even when answers were incomplete. They found comfort in routine, in familiar sounds, in the quiet assurance that morning would come. As lamps dimmed and streets emptied, fear beneath the surface settled into the background. It did not disappear, but it softened in the dark, giving way to rest. The night offered relief from vigilance, allowing minds to loosen their hold on worry. And so, in this period of unfinished peace, the nation slept aware, cautious, yet hopeful enough to continue. Beneath the surface, tensions remained. But above them, life endured, steady and patient, waiting to see what the coming days would bring. As Reconstruction moved forward, a shadow began to lengthen quietly across parts of the nation. It did not always appear openly, nor did it announce itself loudly. Instead, it took shape through whispers, symbols, and unspoken understandings. This shadow belonged to groups that resisted change and sought to restore familiar hierarchies, even as the country attempted to move in a new direction. Among these groups was the Ku Klux Klan, which emerged during the unsettled years following the war. Its presence was not constant everywhere, but where it appeared, it influenced daily life in subtle and lasting ways. The group relied less on open confrontation and more on intimidation, secrecy, and fear methods that often went unnoticed by those not directly affected in many communities. This influence was felt as hesitation. Meetings were held more quietly, travel routes were chosen with greater care. Certain conversations ended abruptly when unfamiliar figures appeared. These adjustments were not always spoken about, but they were understood by those who lived within them. For newly freed Black Americans, the shadow altered the experience of freedom. Rights existed in law, but exercising them required caution. Participation in civic life, voting, organizing, speaking openly, became acts measured carefully against personal safety. Still, many continued, guided by resolve rather than ease. The presence of such groups did not dominate every day. Life continued in markets, schools, and homes. Children still learned their lessons. Families still shared meals. Yet beneath these routines, awareness persisted. The shadow-shaped behavior quietly influencing decisions without always revealing its source. In white communities, reactions varied. Some rejected these movements, uncomfortable with secrecy and intimidation. Others viewed them as familiar or reassuring, clinging to older structures in uncertain times. Many remained silent, choosing distance over involvement. This silence, too, became part of the atmosphere. The broader nation struggled to understand what was unfolding. News traveled slowly and unevenly. Reports were incomplete, often softened by distance or political calculation. In the North, attention drifted elsewhere, and the urgency of Reconstruction began to fade from public focus. Meanwhile, the shadow remained. It did not require constant action to be effective. Its power lay in suggestion, in the possibility of consequence. Often, nothing happened at all and yet behavior changed. This quiet influence proved difficult to confront, precisely because it was rarely visible in full. Despite this, resilience persisted. Communities continued to gather. Schools remained open. Faith and education offered grounding when uncertainty pressed in. Many believed that patience and persistence could outlast intimidation. Even if progress slowed, federal authorities attempted to respond through legislation and enforcement. though efforts were uneven and temporary. Where protection existed, confidence grew. Where it faded, the shadow deepened. Reconstruction's success increasingly depended not only on laws, but on willingness to enforce them. As time passed, the presence of organized resistance reshaped the trajectory of Reconstruction. Momentum slowed. Optimism softened. What had once felt like a shared national project began to fracture into regional experiences. At night, when daily concerns were set aside, these tensions lingered in thought. People reflected quietly on what freedom meant if it could not always be exercised safely. They wondered how long progress would be supported and whether the future would hold firm or retreat. Yet even under shadow, life endured. History shows that influence rooted in fear can shape moments, but it rarely defines all outcomes. Alongside intimidation existed courage, often unrecognized, often unrecorded. Teachers continued teaching. Families continued planning. Communities continued hoping, even when doing so required restraint. As the lamps dimmed and streets grew quiet, the shadow softened with the darkness. Night offered relief from vigilance, allowing rest to return, if only briefly. In sleep, the weight of uncertainty eased, and the nation gathered strength for another day. The shadow cast during this period would leave lasting marks, shaping choices and outcomes for generations. But it did not erase the efforts made, nor the ideals written into law. It became part of the unfinished story, a reminder that progress is rarely uncontested, and that calm persistence often matters as much as bold action. And so, beneath the stars, as the country rested, the shadow remained, but so did the quiet. Determination of those who believed the future could still unfold differently. As Reconstruction unfolded, history itself began to change, not through events, but through storytelling. The past, once lived and remembered in many voices, slowly became shaped by repetition and selective memory. These stories were not always written down at first. They were spoken quietly, shared in homes, classrooms, and community gatherings, where meaning was passed gently from one generation to the next. In the years after the war, many Americans sought comfort in familiarity. The nation had endured loss, uncertainty, and change, and memory offered a sense of stability. Stories that simplified the past, or softened its edges, were easier to carry. Over time, these versions of history gained strength not because they were complete, but because they were repeated in parts of the South. Narratives emerged that framed the war and its aftermath in ways that avoided difficult truths. These stories emphasized honor, tradition, and loss, while minimizing the central role of slavery and the purpose of Reconstruction. They were shared calmly, often without confrontation. Becoming part of local identity, organizations such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy played a role in shaping how history was remembered. Through memorials, textbooks, and public ceremonies, they encouraged interpretations of the past that favored reconciliation without accountability. These efforts were methodical and patient, unfolding over decades rather than years. In schools, history lessons slowly shifted tone. Textbooks emphasized unity and closure, often at the expense of complexity. Reconstruction was described as a troubled experiment rather than a sincere effort at justice. These narratives did not always deny facts outright, but they reframed them, quietly redirecting attention away from unfulfilled promises. For many students, these lessons became their first understanding of the nation's past. They absorbed stories not as debate, but as background truth. History, once dynamic and contested, settled into a smoother, more comfortable form. In the North, distance encouraged simplification as well. As attention turned toward industrial growth and westward expansion, Reconstruction faded from focus. Fatigue played a role. The country was eager to move on, and simplified stories made that easier. Remembering selectively allowed the nation to rest. For Black Americans, these rewritten narratives carried consequences. Their experiences of hope, struggle, and perseverance were often excluded or minimized. Memory became another space where equality was incomplete. Still, stories were preserved quietly within families and communities. passed along with care, waiting for a time when they might be heard more widely. The power of storytelling lies in repetition. Over time, these reshaped memories influenced public opinion, policy decisions, and cultural understanding. They did not arrive as declarations, but as assumptions, ideas so familiar, they no longer felt like interpretations at all. Yet history, even when reshaped, never disappears entirely. Alternative stories continued to exist alongside dominant ones. Scholars, teachers, and community elders preserved more complete accounts, often without recognition. These quieter narratives waited patiently, sustained by those who understood that memory, like justice, requires effort to maintain. Children growing up within these revised histories rarely questioned them. The stories felt settled, resolved. Conflict seemed distant, belonging to a past that no longer demanded attention. This sense of closure, though comforting, came at a cost, leaving unresolved issues. Next, at night, as families gathered and conversations softened, stories were shared not to persuade, but to soothe. Memory became a way to rest, to reassure, to avoid reopening wounds. In this way, storytelling served both healing and forgetting. Over generations, these narratives shaped how Americans understood themselves. Reconstruction became a brief, troubled chapter rather than a defining crossroads. The struggle for equality appeared incomplete but distant. Its urgency softened by time and repetition. Yet beneath these stories, the truth remained layered and complex. History waited quietly for renewed attention, knowing that understanding often arrives not in moments of urgency, but in times of reflection, as the lamps dimmed and the nation settled into sleep. These stories continued their work, some clarifying, others obscuring. Memory rested alongside comfort, shaping dreams of identity and belonging. And so, in the calm passage of years, the past was rewritten not all at once, and not by force, but through gentle repetition. These stories shaped the nation's rest, even as deeper truths waited patiently, ready to be remembered when the time felt right. As the years passed, the nation grew tired not in body alone, but in spirit. Reconstruction had demanded attention, patience, and moral focus, and many Americans felt they had already given enough. The urgency that once fueled rebuilding efforts softened, replaced by a desire for normalcy and rest. In the North, daily life moved steadily forward. Factories expanded, railroads stretched westward, and cities grew louder with industry. The country's energy shifted toward growth and opportunity. Compared to these forward-looking pursuits, Reconstruction began to feel distant, complex, unresolved, and increasingly inconvenient. Newspapers reflected this change in mood. Headlines that once followed developments in the South grew smaller and less frequent. Stories of progress or resistance competed with reports of economic change and innovation. Attention drifted naturally toward what felt immediate and rewarding. In Washington, discussions continued, but enthusiasm waned. Members of the United States Congress faced pressure from constituents eager to move on. Compromise became more attractive than persistence. The nation's earlier determination softened into cautious disengagement. This shift did not happen suddenly. It unfolded quietly, decision by decision, as priorities changed. Policies were adjusted. Enforcement weakened. Support that once felt steady became conditional and temporary. Reconstruction remained in place, but its foundation grew less secure. For many Americans, fatigue felt justified. The war had lasted years. Reconstruction demanded continued effort, with no clear endpoint. People longed for closure, for a sense that the hardest work was behind them. Looking away felt easier than confronting unresolved injustice. In the South, this change was felt almost immediately. As national attention diminished, local power structures regained influence. Without consistent oversight, earlier patterns quietly re-emerged. Change slowed not always openly, but effectively. For Black Americans, this shift brought renewed uncertainty. Rights existed, but protection weakened. Participation in civic life required increasing caution. Still, many continued with quiet resolve, sustaining communities through mutual support and careful planning. The nation's weariness did not erase ideals. Laws remained. Amendments stayed written, but ideals, without attention, can fade into background noise. They remain present, yet inactive, waiting for renewed commitment. Children growing up during this period absorbed the atmosphere naturally. They sensed that certain topics were no longer discussed with urgency. Reconstruction became something historical rather than ongoing. The future appeared settled, even when it was not, as time passed. The country's collective gaze turned outward to expansion, innovation, and prosperity. Looking away from Reconstruction did not feel like abandonment to many. It felt like progress. Yet absence of attention allowed unresolved tensions to deepen quietly. At night, as households rested, this fatigue softened further. The desire for peace outweighed the desire for correction. Silence replaced debate. In the calm of evening, unresolved questions were easier to set aside until morning. History shows that wariness can be as influential as opposition. A tired nation does not always reject justice, simply postpones it. Reconstruction became a chapter many wished to close gently, even if the story was unfinished. As lamps dimmed across the country, the nation rested within this collective exhaustion. The work of rebuilding continued, but with fewer eyes watching and fewer voices insisting. What had once been a national effort became uneven, fragile, and uncertain. And so, in the quiet rhythm of passing years, the nation looked away not in anger, but in fatigue. Reconstruction lingered in the background, its promise still present, yet increasingly unattended, waiting for a future generation to look back and see what had been left undone. Retreat rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with noise or urgency. More often, it unfolds quietly, through small decisions that seem practical at the time. During the later years of Reconstruction, the nation reached such a momentum, turning inward, that felt less like a choice and more like relief. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction no longer stood at the center of national conversation. Its language remained in laws and documents, but its presence in daily attention had softened. The work of rebuilding demanded continued effort, yet the willingness to provide that effort had thinned. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the nation stepped back. Political uncertainty played a role. Elections were contested. Alliances shifted. Stability became a priority, even if it required compromise. In this atmosphere, Reconstruction came to be viewed not as an unfinished responsibility, but as a lingering complication. When Rutherford B. Hayes assumed the presidency, the country stood at a crossroads. Decisions made during this period were framed as necessary steps toward unity and calm. Federal involvement in Southern affairs was reduced, not through dramatic declaration, but through quiet withdrawal. Federal troops, once stationed to protect Reconstruction efforts, were gradually removed. Their departure was not sudden. It occurred through a series of administrative choices, each one easing national tension while simultaneously weakening enforcement. To many Americans outside the South, this retreat felt like resolution. In Southern communities, the change was immediate and tangible. The presence that had offered reassurance, however, authorities shifted back into local hands. Order returned, but it was an order shaped by familiarity rather than reform. For Black Americans, this moment marked a profound shift. Rights still existed in law, but their defense grew uncertain. Participation in public life required renewed caution. Many adapted quietly, relying on community strength rather than institutional protection. The nation, however, largely accepted this retreat. The desire for stability outweighed concern for unfinished justice. Newspapers framed the changes as steps toward harmony. Political leaders spoke of reconciliation and national healing. The language was calm, reassuring, and forward-looking. Retreat, in this sense, was not framed as failure. It was presented as maturity, a nation choosing peace over prolonged effort. The cost of that choice was not immediately acknowledged. Daily life continued much as before. Fields were worked. Schools operated. Churches gathered. The shift in national policy did not disrupt routines overnight. Instead, it altered what was possible over time. narrowing opportunities quietly. Children growing up during this transition sensed no sudden change. Their world adjusted subtly. Expectations shifted. The future felt more predictable, even as its fairness became less certain. History, for them, seemed to settle into a quieter pattern. At night, as families rested, this retreat felt distant and abstract. Decisions made in capitals and chambers rarely intruded on evening calm. The nation slept within a sense of closure, believing a difficult chapter was ending. Yet retreat carries memory. What was stepped away from did not disappear. The promise of reconstruction of equal protection and shared citizenship remained written, though unattended. Like a road left unfinished, it waited quietly, visible to those who remembered where it was meant to lead. The moment of retreat did not erase the efforts that came before it. Schools established during Reconstruction continued educating students. Communities formed during those years persisted. Hope did not vanish, it adapted, becoming more guarded, more patient. History often marks its turning points with dates and names, but lived experience tells a softer story. Retreat was felt not as an event, but as a gradual narrowing of possibility. A sense that something once protected was now left to stand on its own, as the stars rose over a resting nation. This retreat blended into the background of American life. It did not disturb sleep. It did not demand attention, and yet it shaped the decades that followed, influencing who felt secure and who did not. The nation had chosen calm over commitment, silence over insistence, retreat over resolve. And so, in the stillness of night, Reconstruction's most fragile moment passed quietly, leaving behind laws without guardians, promises without presence, and a future that would one day return to this crossroads, asking what might have happened had the nation chosen to stay. After the moment of retreat, life did not collapse or erupt into chaos. Instead, it settled quietly and unevenly into a new pattern. The absence of protection was not always visible at first. There were no sudden announcements, no dramatic shifts in daily routine. Yet, over time, its effects became part of ordinary life. In many southern communities, authority returned to familiar hands. Local governments resumed control with confidence, shaping rules and customs according to long-standing traditions. For some residents, this brought a sense of stability. For others, it introduced new limits that narrowed opportunity without drawing attention to themselves. For Black Americans, daily life required careful navigation. Rights still existed in principle, but exercising them demanded restraint and awareness. Choices were weighed quietly: where to work, when to speak, how visible to be in public life. Communities relied increasingly on internal strength, turning inward to protect one another through shared effort and mutual care. Work continued much as it had before. Fields were planted, trades were practiced, homes were maintained. The rhythm of daily labor offered continuity, even as the boundaries around advancement slowly tightened. Progress did not stop entirely, but it became more difficult to sustain openly. Education remained a priority, though resources grew scarce. Schools established during Reconstruction struggled to survive, supported by communities that understood their importance. Teachers worked with dedication, often under challenging conditions, keeping learning alive through persistence rather than support. Churches grew even more central during this period. They provided not only spiritual guidance, but organization and reassurance. Within these spaces, people spoke freely, planned carefully, and found comfort in shared identity. Faith offered steadiness when institutions did not. In the broader national view, these changes unfolded quietly. Without federal presence, local practices shaped experience more than law. Newspapers spoke less often of Southern affairs, and when they did, the tone was subdued. The country, focused elsewhere, accepted this new normal with little reflection. Children growing up during this time adapted naturally. They learned which paths were open and which were not. They absorbed expectations without question, shaping their ambitions accordingly. For them, life after protection felt simply like life itself, yet memory persisted. Older generations remembered a time when possibility had felt wider, when protection, however imperfect, had existed. These memories were shared softly, often within families, carried forward not as protest, but as quiet understanding. Over time, organizations would emerge to challenge the narrowing of rights and opportunity, including groups such as the NAACP, though their influence would come later. For now, most resistance took the form of endurance of continuing to build, teach, and hope within limited space. Life after protection was not defined by constant struggle. Most days were ordinary. People worked, rested, and found moments of joy. Music was played, stories were told, children laughed. The human capacity for adaptation softened the weight of restriction. Night. When the day's demands faded, thoughts turned inward. Some reflected on what had been promised and what had been lost. Others focused simply on tomorrow's tasks. Sleep arrived, not as escape, but as necessity, a pause from vigilance. History often remembers this period through laws and systems, but lived experience tells a quieter story. It was a time shaped less by confrontation than by constraint, less by violence than by absence. Protection had gone, and in its place grew a careful, watchful way of living. Yet even within this narrowing, life endured with dignity. Communities preserved knowledge. Families nurtured ambition quietly. Hope adapted, becoming patient rather than bold, as the stars rose and households settled into rest. This new reality rested alongside them. It did not demand attention. It did not announce itself, but it shaped futures, all the same, guiding paths, setting limits, and leaving questions for generations yet to come. And so, in the calm of night, life after protection continued, not broken, but constrained, waiting for a future moment, when the promise once spoken might again be taken up and carried forward. As the years passed, the loud debates of Reconstruction faded into the background, replaced by something quieter, but more not an empty silence, but a practiced one. A silence shaped by habit, caution, and the slow acceptance of limits. This silence did not arrive suddenly. It grew, settling gently over daily life, shaping generations without ever announcing itself. Children, born after Reconstruction, grew up without direct memory of its promises. They inherited a world already adjusted, where expectations were clearly set, and certain paths felt naturally closed. Questions that once stirred national debate were no longer asked openly. Silence became a teacher, guiding behavior without explanation. In homes, stories were shared selectively. Elders remembered moments when opportunity felt closer, when protection, however, fragile, had existed. These memories were passed along quietly, often softened with time. Some stories were told fully, others only hinted at. Silence filled the spaces where explanation felt risky or exhausting. Schools reflected this quiet shaping. Lessons focused on progress and unity, rarely lingering on unfinished struggles. History appeared orderly and resolved. Students learned dates and outcomes, but not always the tensions that followed. Silence smoothed complexity into simplicity, making the past easier to carry. For Black American families, silence served multiple purposes. It was a form of protection, shielding children from harsh realities before they were ready. It was also a strategy, allowing families to navigate a restrictive world without drawing attention. Knowledge was shared carefully, when necessary, and often privately. In white communities, silence took a different form. Many accepted the world as it was, rarely questioning how it had come to be. Comfort grew in familiarity, without reminders of what had been promised and left undone. The present felt stable enough. Workplaces, neighborhoods, and public spaces followed established patterns. These patterns did not require explanation. They were simply understood. Silence maintained order without confrontation, preserving arrangements that benefited some while limiting others over time. Silence became tradition. Generations learned how to move within it. They learned which ambitions were encouraged and which were discouraged, which conversations were safe and which were avoided. Silence shaped choices long before they were consciously made. Yet silence did not erase awareness entirely. Within families and close communities, quiet understanding persisted. People recognized unfairness even when they did not name it aloud. They adapted with patience, focusing on survival, education, and preparation. Progress continued, but slowly and often out of view. Churches, social gatherings, and private meetings became places where silence softened. Within trusted spaces, people spoke more freely, sharing hopes and concerns without fear. These moments kept memory alive, even when public discussion remained limited. Children raised in this environment grew skilled at reading between lines. They sensed what was not said. They learned to interpret pauses and tones. Silence taught them caution, but also resilience. At night, when the world grew quiet, silence felt less heavy. In the dark, thoughts could wander safely. Questions could be considered without needing immediate answers. Sleep offered a space where awareness rested without consequence. History moved forward quietly during these years. Laws hardened, customs solidified. Silence allowed systems to endure without constant defense. What was once contested became normalized. Yet silence is never complete. It holds memory within it, waiting. Stories preserved in whispers, journals, and family recollections carried forward truths that public narratives overlooked. These quiet records waited patiently for a time when listening might return. Generations shaped by silence did not forget. They adapted. They endured. They learned how to survive within limits while imagining futures beyond them. Silence taught restraint. But it also preserved longing, as the stars rose and households settled into rest. This silence rested too woven into identity, memory, and expectation. It shaped how people understood their place in the world, and how they imagined what might someday change. The nation slept beneath this silence for many years, unaware of how deeply it had shaped itself. Yet beneath the quiet surface, memory remained alive, steady, patient, and ready. Because silence, though powerful, is never permanent. In the end, history does not always ask to be remembered loudly. Some chapters return not through speeches or monuments, but through quiet reflection, through moments when the past gently rises into awareness and asks to be understood rather than judged. The story of Reconstruction, and its unfinished promise, belongs to this quieter kind of memory. For many years, the nation moved forward without looking back. Silence, routine, and familiarity carried people through daily life. Generations were shaped by what was present and by what was absent. Yet memory, even when softened, does not disappear. It waits patiently, carried in stories, documents, and the quiet recognition that something meaningful was left unresolved. To remember quietly is not to reopen old wounds. It is to acknowledge that history is layered, shaped by choices both made and avoided. Reconstruction was not simply a failure or a success. It was an attempt, careful, imperfect, and human. Understanding it deeply requires patience rather than urgency. As time passed, scholars, teachers, and communities began to revisit this period with calmer eyes. They looked not for blame, but for clarity. They listened to voices that had long been overlooked. They read between the lines of laws and customs, recognizing that silence itself can shape outcomes. This deeper understanding does not demand anger, it invites awareness. When history is approached gently, it offers perspective rather than pressure. It shows how fatigue, fear, hope, and silence can influence a nation's direction just as powerfully as speeches and votes. Reconstruction reminds us that progress is not only built through action, but sustained through attention. For modern listeners, this story offers space for reflection. It suggests that the present is always connected to choices made long ago, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. Understanding this connection does not disturb rest. It deepens it. Awareness, when calm, brings acceptance rather than unrest. At night, when distractions fade and the mind slows, history feels different. It becomes less about conflict and more about continuity. Less about argument and more about understanding. In this stillness, the past can be held gently. Without urgency or fear, remembering quietly allows the nation to breathe. It creates room for empathy, for recognizing that people acted within the limits of their time. just as we do now. It encourages thoughtful listening rather than reaction, and it reminds us that unfinished stories are not failures, they are invitations. As this story settles into its final moments, there is nothing left to resolve tonight. No conclusions to force, no judgments to make, only the understanding that history, like rest, unfolds best when given time. So allow these reflections to soften and fade, like distant echoes carried away by the night. Let the past rest where it belongs, remembered, understood, and no longer heavy. As the quiet deepens and sleep draws near, may this gentle remembering offer calm rather than concern, perspective rather than pressure, and rest rather than restlessness. History has spoken softly. Now it is time to rest.